It's so good, but you don't have to hear it twice. Hello, everyone. I'm Zev Shalev. Welcome to Narrative Live on a really special edition of the show. I'm live in New York. I'll be joined in a few minutes by Gary Darden, the historian and professor from Fairleigh Dickinson University. But before we get there, a few thoughts about what's been going on. I actually didn't think today's show was going to be airable because we expected the trial to still be going on. And of course, that did not happen because a perfect storm descended on Trump's defenders today, it seemed. His lawyers abruptly ended their case really early, leaving the GOP and their senators scrambling to figure out what they can do next in the face of the very big news. And the big news is the book that was written by John Bolton. No one's really seen this book, but some of it has been leaked to the New York Times. And of course, he's the former national security advisor to the president. He's about the least likely person on ideological grounds you'd expect to be arguing against the president's guilt, though for the president's guilt. And yet here he is doing that. The big news is, of course, that he writes very damningly about what the president did, that he accuses the president and has first-hand knowledge of the president's attempts to extort Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to launch an investigation into the Bidens. And just as the GOP and the Fox News crews and teams online began to scorched earth policy in a campaign to try and destroy Bolton's credibility, Trump's former White House chief of staff, John Kelly, emerged today to say he believes John Bolton. So you've got a really big deal going on. You've got the legal team quitting early, basically saying that they're not going to be able to complete a real full argument. Well, at least that's a signal that they're giving. The senators retreat for a couple of days, preparing for questions, but also starting to whip up the votes. And at the same time, you've got this book by John Bolton, which is very critical of the president. And then John Kelly comes along to say he believes John Bolton. On top of that, you had these basically unconstitutional arguments being argued yesterday and today by the president's legal team. Alan Dershowitz, who is still embroiled to this day in allegations that he took part in Jeffrey Epstein's blackmail and extortion scheme involving underage girls. I don't know why he was even allowed to be testifying in front of the Senate, but there he was. And he was making this audacious argument that the President of the United States could only be impeached for committing actual crimes, as opposed to what the Constitution says, which are high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, this is not only what the Constitution does not call for, and is also not what the framers intended, but Dershowitz's arguments also have this fatal flaw, and it seems to go right through all the legal defenses that the president's team has been putting forward. Dershowitz and his good friend Bill Barr, who's Alan Barr, and his good friend Bill Barr also argue that the president cannot be investigated and that the president cannot be indicted for committing crimes while in office. You remember that's why during the Mueller report, they said the president could not be investigated or indicted. So if the president can't be investigated or indicted while in office, and if you believe Dershowitz, he could only be impeached for crimes, actual crimes while in office, then the president cannot be impeached. He basically becomes king, and you can just throw away the American Constitution and hope for the best. And it's on that point that I'd like to bring in Gary Darden. Hi, Gary, professor of history, American history from Fairleigh Dickinson, just across the river here in New Jersey. Nice to see you, Gary.
Nice to see you.
So we've had quite a few days. I've been just nonstop watching everything, and it's been interesting. What do you think of the latest things that have been happening today, which is this early end to the defense, and then this attempt to whip the votes by Mitch McConnell, and it looks like he doesn't have the right number of votes to at least stop witnesses from being called.
Well, I think getting witnesses to be called was going to be a close vote regardless, down to probably, 4 or 5 senators at the most just to get over the finish line, and there would be a battle. But Bolton's book and what it states really was a game changer, because Bolton is someone who was in the room during this call with the Ukraine. Bolton is not exactly someone you can put a harness on and dictate what he's going to say. He can be a loose cannon, and I think that's what terrifies a lot of people in the White House. And I think it makes McConnell's job much more difficult. At the beginning of this week, it seemed he was in control of his caucus, and now it seems that he's not. But he still has 2 more days. This vote may not take place until Friday afternoon.
Now, you say that this vote, you're just referring specifically to the vote on whether to call witnesses.
Yes.
And that vote could look like anything, right? I mean, ultimately, Mitch McConnell is in charge of this process. He could say, I want to call any witness or all witnesses, or you could say I want to call only Biden Hunter, or I can call John Bolton and Biden Hunter, for example. That's correct, right? He has a full sort of choice here in terms of what he wants to do.
It could be a vote on one witness like Bolton. It could be a vote on multiple witnesses. The key is going to be Bolton. So the idea is if somehow 51 senators can vote for Bolton, then the dike's been broken, and it may unleash a torrent of witnesses that serve both the Democratic case and the Republican case. If it happens, then all bets are off. This trial may not be done by this weekend, and it could drag in for another week or two or longer.
Now, as we look at the people who might vote in favor of witnesses, there are sort of two obvious ones. Collins and Romney have agreed that they, or seem to indicate they'll vote in favor of allowing witnesses, or at least John Bolton as a witness. The others are a little harder to spot. What do you think are the options there? What do you think is looking likely in the Senate in terms of people who might join that duo?
I think the two most likely are Lisa Murkowski. And Murkowski is a really interesting character in the Senate because she was defeated in her party's primary by a Sarah Palin-backed Tea Party candidate.
Right.
She went ahead and ran, and she won her Senate seat, her re-election, as a write-in candidate. And that hadn't been done since Strom Thurmond back in the mid-20th century in South Carolina. So she has this sort of fiercely earned independent voice in Alaska that's not totally beholden to Mitch McConnell. The other candidate I think that might be likely to support witnesses is Lamar Alexander. And Lamar Alexander was a governor of Tennessee back in the 80s, went on to have a very secure Senate seat. He was part of the Republican leadership, but historically he's been a fairly moderate voice, and he's retiring. And this is a guy that's been respected on both sides of the aisle, and he may be at a point where he goes, I don't have to do anything but look at my record and my legacy. And so since he's leaving the Senate come January of 2021, he could be one of the likely votes.
There are others also leaving the Senate. Isn't Burr on his last round there, and he might be someone who can get away with a vote like that?
I think he's possible. There's also been mention of Ben Sasse in Nebraska. He's been pretty quiet, but Ben Sasse is one of the last senators that's still in there since Jeff Flake left that has been willing to criticize the behavior and the judgment calls of President Trump. And Nebraska is a conservative state, but he's a fairly popular and respected senator.
And Tooney is an interesting voice to be hearing from a conservative, at least, who might be in favor of at least some sort of horse trading around witnesses.
Toomey's been interesting because Toomey's been willing to be part of that group of 6 to 8 senators that are willing to cross the aisle and broker a deal. And he did this back in the Obama administration, and he may well be a player. He's not someone that's going to stand in front of the camera and say this, but he is the kind of guy that is a conduit between the moderate and right-wing flanks of his party, and this is the kind of guy that may strike a deal in the cloakroom.
Right. So we're looking at a situation here where, even despite incredible evidence that the president has committed crimes that are impeachable, or high crimes and misdemeanors, if you want to argue that, and yet he still may get away with it. He still may get acquitted because we're aiming for 65, 66 votes, right? So that's 67 votes. So it's
2/3, 67.
So that's a very high bar. It's not going to be reached very easily. So, are we still looking at essentially a system that maybe is not that workable? The more I look at the sort of the mechanism of the Senate trial, the more you realize, firstly, it hasn't been tested very much. There's only been 2 presidential impeachment trials in the Senate before. And secondly, it is impossible, it seems, to get beyond the party political, politics of the day because you require this 2/3 majority. Were the framers maybe mistaken in some of their assumptions here that this was a mechanism that could really work to impeach a president, or were they doing it to make it incredibly hard to actually remove a president in order just to send him a signal, a message that he better get back in line, but not really convict and remove him from office? So that would be incredibly egregious, a crime that he'd have to commit to do that.
I think it's both. I think they wanted the process to be arduous. They wanted there to be a mechanism to impeach the president, which is essentially, in legal court terms, an indictment. And the indictment, like a grand jury, would then send the articles of impeachment to a body to try. Now, James Madison had argued that impeachment should be handled by the Supreme Court because they are buffered from political will, because they're lifetime appointments. But part of the debate against that was that if the president had committed a crime that required a trial outside of the impeachment process after office, that you wouldn't want the Supreme Court to be in the end ultimately hearing the political trial, that is impeachment and conviction or non-conviction, and what might be a civil or a criminal trial outside of office. So the compromise was that the Senate, this deliberative body, would be the juror, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would preside. And keep in mind, from the first election in 1788 until the Constitution was amended in 1913, senators were not directly elected by the voters. Oh. Voters would elect their legislature. So in the state of New York, where I live, the state legislature in Albany, both chambers would basically, by majority vote, decide who would hold the Senate seat for a 6-year term. So if the Democrats controlled Albany, they would likely send a Democrat to Washington. If the Republicans controlled Albany, they would send a Republican. So they were trying to buffer the partisan nature of an impeachment trial with the direct election of senators. It's shifted away from what the original intent was of the founding fathers.
So in fact, the directly electing senators from the electorate has maybe made it a less powerful a tool than it might have been if it was a representative sent from the actual Senate bodies of representatives.
Well, the argument for direct election of senators was that they're held more accountable to the voters.
Right.
And that's a very important idea. This comes out of all the debates of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era reforms. It's one of the big reforms of the 3 constitutional amendments that were passed in the 19-teens. But like with any reform, there's going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. Mm-hmm. And many of these senators feel the red heat of either being taken out in a primary or losing their seat in the general election, like Susan Collins or Cory Booker in Colorado.
So what I want to do for the rest of the show is look at things by the numbers. And the first number is the number 3, which is the number of times the Senate has tried a sitting U.S. president in a trial to convict and remove him. Now, the Senate has only done this twice before, and it's in the cases of Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, which makes it really just these 3 guys, Johnson, Trump, and Clinton, who are actual recipients of this honor, I guess, dubious honor of being tried in the Senate. Now, that is not a lot for you as an historian and the rest of us to go on. I mean, it's impossible to see what might happen because there's not much historical precedent at the end of the day.
Well, there's been 44 men have entered the White House, although Trump's the 45th president. Grover Cleveland had inconsecutive terms. Oh, so 40 men have entered the White House, and 3 of them have been impeached and tried in the Senate. Had Nixon not resigned, he would have been impeached. He would have been tried in the Senate. So we're talking a relatively small fraction of the office holders actually were impeached.
Right.
And one of the things I would say that if you read sort of the literature on impeachment, is impeachment in every sense of the word, it is a political trial. It's not a criminal trial. It's not a civil trial. It's a political trial involving political operators. It's involving officers of the Constitution, which is exactly what Congress, the House of Representatives reps are, and it's exactly what the U.S. senators are, and it's exactly what the Chief Justice is. It is a political trial, which means politics and partisan emotion is going to permeate such a trial and process, no matter how we wish it not to be.
Right, but it is still an incredibly consequential trial. I mean, you could say, hey, it's just politics, but there's a lot of things that are just politics. This is in this particular case, in Donald Trump's case, you're dealing with issues of national security. You're dealing with issues that could be bordering on treasonous, and beyond just your typical bribery and corruption, like absolutely, game-changing rebalancing of global power kind of things. It's not less consequential because it's a political trial.
No, I would agree. And what makes this one extremely unique is that what brought us to this point is the very fact that this involves Trump's interaction with a foreign power. Mm-hmm. And in regards to that country's relationship with Russia, which is in sort of an undeclared ground war versus Russia in eastern Ukraine. And even though Trump may not, many Americans and many Republicans still see Russia as one of our most aggressive and chief adversaries.
Right. And
So this is a foreign policy driven, national security driven impeachment, and that has never happened in the other two trials.
And that's why I think the outcome is really uncertain, because the other two were a little bit more predictable. This one becomes less predictable because the outcomes are so serious. Now, the next number, 0, you've sort of touched on this before. Now, that's the number of times a Senate trial has actually convicted and removed a president of the United States. And this sort of leads you into Nixon, because Nixon, although he was impeached, never actually got to the trial stage because he was convinced, basically, not to go through it because they didn't have the votes in that case. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Well, the issue with Nixon is, Nixon did not order the break-in at the Watergate complex, but many of the people that worked on his campaign, including his attorney general, his chief of staff, his chief domestic advisor, his chief counsel, many of them were involved and knew about this break-in to benefit Nixon's campaign. That is, to get into the DNC headquarters at the Watergate complex down by the Potomac River. Once Nixon found out that this actually did take place, that his men did it, what he did is he lied in order to cover up and then took illegal campaign cash to basically buy off people.
Right.
And he lied to the press and he lied to Congress about his actions. Once the tapes were ordered by the Supreme Court, the public knew that Nixon had been lying to the public since 1972. So 72 into 73 into 74. And what happens once those tapes are released is the House Judiciary Committee had already passed articles of impeachment. The next step was the floor of the House. The Democrats controlled the House. Nixon knew he was going to be impeached. He thought he could weather a trial in the Senate with enough Republicans defending him. And what happens is Barry Goldwater, the arch conservative senator from Arizona, who was also the 1964 Republican presidential nominee that Lyndon Johnson, crushed, went to the White House with 2 moderate Republicans and told the president, you do not have the votes in the Senate, you will lose the trial, and equally important, you don't have my vote. So
Right.
Goldwater basically told Nixon, I will vote for your removal based on the evidence that I know now. And the next day, Nixon resigned from office, basically to protect his pension, to protect the humiliation of being forcibly removed from office. And that's where we found ourselves. So had a trial taken place, most historians would argue that Nixon would have lost that trial by 2/3 or more of the votes.
So that's 67 votes, as we've said. So that's significant. Now, obviously, that scenario would have played out already if they'd had enough votes to, or if they didn't have enough votes to secure a Trump acquittal, or what am I saying? If they had enough votes to find him guilty, that scenario would have happened already. McConnell and others would have gone over to the White House and told Trump, you're not going to make it. You better go now and make the deal that you need now. Because, as you've mentioned to me before, it matters whether you get to the trial or not in terms of pardons and other things. Because someone who's impeached cannot be pardoned. Is that correct?
There's open interpretation, but if someone is impeached, the offenses for which you're impeached, you cannot be pardoned for. And so
Right.
that's in debate, but a lot of scholars, including Robert Reich, the former labor secretary for Bill Clinton, wrote an article in The Guardian saying exactly that. And other political scientists have made the same argument.
So that's really...
So Nixon resigning also prevented him from actually being formally impeached.
Right. Oh, so he resigned before the actual formal impeachment process. That's
Only the House Judiciary Committee had passed articles. It was now going to go to the floor of the House. He didn't have the votes there.
So they would have. So back to my point, I think that McConnell would have done this already, or someone would have done this already, had marched over to the White House and said, "You better resign." They obviously have a high confidence they're not going to get to 67 votes. So they are working just on the basis of these 51 or so people who might vote for just witnesses. Now, is there any real harm for just saying, well, we want witnesses, it'll make us look more legitimate at the end of the day? Even if we land up acquitting, at least we're allowing a fair trial to go ahead. Why is there so much resistance even to allowing witnesses like John Bolton to testify?
Well, there's a famous adage among court lawyers is you don't ask a witness a question unless you know the answer beforehand.
Right. Good point.
Most good trial lawyers get screwed up when they ask a bombshell question that gets a bombshell answer.
Right.
And so they don't want witnesses that might possibly give answers that could be damning to the president's case. And clearly what Bolton's already saying in this book that the New York Times has reviewed aggressively contradicts what the president said. They keep saying there's no eyewitness testimony, yet Bolton was in the room during the call.
Oh,
and he's the one that basically...
And in several other conversations, one-on-one
several other
conversations.
conversations.
Yeah. It's hard
And
to
we also
ask
know-
for anyone more directly, with direct knowledge of the events than him.
And yeah, so Bolton is right there at the center of this because he was the national security advisor. This was regarding funds for weapons and supplies to help Ukraine defend its national security from an aggressive Russia. So Bolton is as good a witness as you can put on the stand in this case. And because he was fired and no longer reports to the president, he's somewhat liberated to speak his mind. And he is renowned for his blunt candor, which is why the Republicans do not want him.
And you've got someone like John Kelly lining up behind him saying he's credible, listen to him, I believe what he says. Kelly would have had some knowledge, at least until the time he left the White House, of what the president was doing, because this does stretch back all the way to 2018. There's a lot in here that could hurt the Republicans. So if they thought there was even a risk of this happening, you'd think they would have gone to him with a deal earlier on. They would have said, this isn't, look, there's a possibility here, we're not going to be able to secure this. And yet here we are in a position where it looks like maybe they can't secure it.
Here's the interesting thing is I don't think Bolton can be bought or bullied on this. If he were still in the White House as national security advisor, the president would have leverage on him. But he's a free range actor right now.
Yeah.
And this testimony, truth be told, is going to allow him to sell a hell of a lot more books.
And you'd think that, he's a constitutionalist. There are a lot of people there who believe in the American Constitution, and what's going on right now, especially with these arguments from Alan Dershowitz and company, which just are, negate everything the Constitution says. It must be worrying for people who are concerned about the future of the basics of our republic, the founding principles that set up this republic.
Well, because there's the hypocrisy. You see what Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham said back in the Clinton impeachment. They betrayed what they said then versus now. Dershowitz and Ken Starr, arguments they made in the Clinton impeachment era, are completely belied by what they're saying now. So if you're watching a news source that reports the information accurately and fairly, most people can see the hypocrisy of this. But the thing the Republicans are clinging to is that right now the latest poll has about 48% support removal from office and about 47% do not. That number has tightened in the last couple of weeks, and Republicans are banking on that. And I think when I had spoken on this broadcast in the fall, I had mentioned, we talked about Nixon, is that the public support for Nixon's impeachment and removal went from 30% up to 60 and 70%. So by the time Nixon resigned, 3/4 of the public was against him. If those numbers were present right now, then you would have people going to the White House worried about the actual vote in the Senate. But we live in we live in much more hyper-partisan times than we did in the 1970s.
For sure. There is a 75% number out there today that came out from the Quinnipiac poll. And that's this, there's 75% of Americans are in favor of hearing witnesses and new evidence in this trial. Now that is a very significant number. I mean, it's not one that you can really easily ignore. And I think it's as high as 95% amongst Democrats, but, lower obviously amongst Republicans, but the average there is 75. That's a difficult number to argue against when you're a swing senator that might be losing their seat if this trial doesn't appear to be fair and balanced. Your thoughts on this new poll?
Well, the poll's pretty impressive because, again, wanting to have witnesses is different than wanting the president to stay in office or removed.
Right.
It's a passive decision about, hey, I need more information. And if you're a Democrat, you hope the information is so damning that it sways that public opinion for removal. If you're a Republican, you're afraid that the information is going to shift public opinion. And if public opinion begins to shift through Bolton or multiple witnesses, then you begin to see the vote numbers slide. I think a scenario that seems most likely with witnesses is we're not going to see 67 senators vote for removal. I think one of the best case scenarios for the Democrats in terms of the 2020 election is that for 51 or more senators to vote for removal. So
that's a good segue to my next number, because my next number is the number one. And that's the number of votes that Andrew Johnson escaped conviction for his removal from office. The actual tally during that one was 35-19, as for the Senate. But, that's basically what you're saying, is that there is a potential here that the Democrats may still eke out what appears to be a victory, even though they may not ultimately get a removal from office and a conviction from the Senate. They might, anything above 50 is going to appear to people like he should have, like a majority, like he should have gone. And then, he's a lame duck president, basically, because he has no authority to continue operating for the rest of his term.
Yeah, it becomes the impeachment is a stain on his record. And if he get 51 or 52 senators to vote for removal, it won't remove him. But what it says to history and to the American public is that the president lost a vote of confidence in both a democratically held democratically held House and in a Republican-held Senate. It may not make him a lame duck, because being a lame duck means you have a sense of humility, and Trump is going to behave as if he's going to see this as, I wasn't removed, keep swinging the golf club.
Right.
But I do think it will harm him going into the fall elections, that a majority of the Senate rebuked him. And also, it looks less partisan.
Right. It does look less partisan. It's going to make a very difficult time for the Republicans running for re-election if he's on the ticket with them, if he gets a majority of people in the Senate voting against him as well. Tell us a little bit more, if you will, about Andrew Johnson, because he's an interesting character. Originally, he was running with Lincoln, and nobody ever expected Mr. Johnson to be the president of the United States. But, Lincoln died, obviously, and there he was. Andrew Johnson became the leader. Now, he wasn't even a Republican. He was running under some sort of national unity ticket with Lincoln.
Yeah, the 1860 election destroyed the National Democratic Party, because Southern Democrats went with the South, and Northern Democrats lost half of their fellow Democrats that would serve in the Senate and serve in the House. But Johnson remained loyal to the Union. And as a result of this, Lincoln made him the military governor of occupied Tennessee. And Lincoln, fearing he would lose the 1864 election, offered this Democrat, not a Republican, the vice presidency to offer a sense of national unity. Now, lo and behold, no one thought Lincoln would be assassinated. So all of a sudden, the Republican Party, which won the sweeping re-election in 1864, now had an ideological career Democrat and a former slave owner in the White House. And he was blocking a lot of Reconstruction legislation designed to protect the freedmen, the 4 million African Americans. So Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act, saying that the president cannot remove a cabinet member approved by the Senate. Mm-hmm. And they were doing this to basically keep General Grant as the head of the Army and Edwin Stanton as Secretary of Defense. And Johnson vetoes the bill. Congress then overrides the veto with a 2/3 vote. Johnson fires Stanton, and the breach of that law becomes the basis to impeach and remove Johnson from office. And the day of the trial, the votes seem to be there for Johnson's removal. And what happens that day is a freshman senator from Kansas cast a not guilty vote, and literally by one vote, Johnson will remain in office from February 1868 until his replacement takes over at the inauguration, which was then held back in March of 1869. So it was a hairpin moment in U.S. history.
It is interesting when you look at the actual crimes that people are impeached for here. He's basically, the crime in this case was firing a cabinet minister. In the case of Nixon, it was, the break-in, but more than that, it was about his being, perjuring himself. Is what you were saying, I think, in the previous description.
It was obstruction of Congress. It was basically lying to Congress. Right. He was breaking the law. He basically was not allowing Congress to do its investigation. And
then the only other thing we get to go on is the next number I'm going to show you, which is the number 50, and that is the number of, and it speaks to the point you were just making. The number of 50 is the number of senators who voted to convict and remove Bill Clinton from office for obstruction of justice. Now, that wasn't the main thing he was up for. He was up for perjury, of course, because he lied in testimony. But the higher vote came on the obstruction of justice. Tell us a little bit about that, because you does again point to this idea that, he got half of the Senate voting against him. That is super significant.
That is. It's exactly half, but you're talking about that Clinton had been under investigation for many years, and the Clinton administration was not eager or happy to cooperate with a Republican-controlled Senate and House since the 1994 midterms, when the Republicans had a shocking sweep and took over the House for the first time since the 50s and the Senate for the first time since the 1980 Reagan landslide. The perjury charge is interesting because Clinton was asked under oath, did you have sex with Monica Lewinsky? And 8 presidents in the 20th century committed adultery before, during, or after their presidency. So the question,
as far as we know.
As far as we know, but these are documented presidents that had committed some form of extramarital affair. And you have to ask yourself, if you're going to ask a public official under oath with cameras and the press, did you commit adultery? The president at that very moment has a choice to lie and protect himself and his family, or say yes and destroy his career and destroy his family. And so the public, at no point did less than 2/3 of the American public think that Clinton should be removed for lying about adultery. As egregious and harmful as it was to Hillary Clinton and her family, and many Americans found what he did repugnant, they did not believe that that rose to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor to be removed from office. And I think the 50-50 vote on obstruction was right down party lines, with some Republicans not voting for this, as really sort of the last punch of the Republicans after years of Ken Starr's investigations.
But really, when you look at all these offenses, when you start comparing, Nixon's offenses, serious, and got him out of office. You got Johnson's offenses, which obviously you think not that serious, like, firing a cabinet minister is probably something you'd expect your president to do these days quite often. And then, Clinton's offenses, which are lying and obstructing justice. The scale of things that you're looking at for Donald Trump, is so significant. It's so massive. When you look at it on a sliding scale, you think, well, these guys, some of them were at least got a majority of senators. Others were able to in Johnson's case, almost get to full impeachment. What is going on here? Has the sliding scale of justice just shifted so far under Donald Trump that we have lost our bearings, that, we now think it's okay for the President of the United States to be so egregiously in contravention of the Constitution that it's okay for him to just continue doing it?
Well, I accept the word you use. There's no doubt in my mind, as a historian of American politics, is that the case against Trump is the strongest impeachment case lodged against any president. I would put Trump's number 1, Nixon's number 2, Andrew Johnson's 3, and Clinton's 4, with the lower 2 not worthy of removal from office, Johnson and Clinton. What we find ourselves in is a hyper-partisan moment where there was an article once written saying that many Trump supporters have a different definition of corruption. Corruption to them is not classic wheeling and dealing, withholding money, promising money, but it's about what they perceive to be the corruption of American culture. And this comes to the heart of white nationalism. So for Trump supporters, he's seen as this valiant knight that's going to save the unwhitening of America. So by battling the Chinese and the Mexicans on trade, battling the incoming presence of non-white immigrants from the Middle East and from Mexico and Muslim immigrants, he's fighting a different type of corruption in the mind of many Trump supporters than what you and I would see as he broke the law. He was withholding legal money from Ukraine to basically do a mafia ploy against Biden in the election.
They don't care about that as much. They care about the corruption of their bloodline.
They see Trump as fighting a form of corruption in their mind that is more important than this sort of mafia classic breaking the law, withholding tax dollars, strong-arming people that comes right out of The Godfather. That to them is less concerning. It's very concerning to me. It's very concerning to you. And it's very concerning to a majority of Americans. But it had the opinion polls ever moved in the direction that 60% supported removal, we would be having a very different conversation about the Senate trial. But as long as Trump has strong support from his own party and Mitch McConnell is holding on to his caucus pretty strongly, they see the removal of Trump as more devastating to the party than keeping him.
I had not heard that analysis before, and it's about the first time I've heard analysis that makes sense to me, because it's really hard to otherwise justify what's going on, unless you're saying that they're working on a different sort of, they're in a different paradigm. They're worried about, about who they are as a people on a level that is very different than about just the everyday legalities of our Constitution or the law in general. And to them, maybe the Constitution doesn't matter as much, even though they're very still solid Americans. Because that's the message you're sort of getting from the trial.
Well, for many Trump supporters, they see 2016 and Trump's election as the last grasp to prevent the demographic shifts in the United States. They cannot change the fact that in 2010, more non-white children were born in the United States than white children. Mm-hmm. So if you extrapolate that out 20, 25 years, America's demography is changing. But if you can slow down or limit or clip immigration, if you can engage in voter restriction and ballot tampering and all sorts of issues and using social media as a platform to manipulate public opinion, this won't change that demography, but what it's doing is it's slowing it down. It's making the inevitable slower.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting as we look at the Democratic field out there, running in Iowa. There's a definite feel that somewhere along the line, especially if Sanders wins this first round, that someone like Bloomberg is going to become an even more likely candidate than even Biden right now because of his kind of blurry Democratic credentials. He's sort of a middle of the road Republican and Democrat. He sort of is the kind of person who maybe can espouse some of the same kind of conservative ideas around immigration, but still have some of these other liberal ideas around the economy and some other things like welfare and those kinds of issues.
Well, the Democratic Party today, I think, is divided between two flanks, and this first reared its head in the Clinton Bernie primary back in 2015 into 16. There's the revolutionary wing of the party that wants real fundamental radical change over healthcare, student loans, the environment, the Green New Deal. And then there are the restoration Democrats. And the restoration Democrats, like Biden, Buttigieg, and Bloomberg, they want basically a restoration of the status quo before Trump. Mm-hmm. And they want to return to decency. It's a much more moral reclamation path, whereas the revolutionaries want economic populism. They want economic populism to literally lock horns like two rams on a mountain with the cultural white nationalist populism of Trump. My fear is that cultural populism or nationalist populism tends to beat economic populism in most instances, because Trump right now has the white working class largely behind him, which means Trump's opponent to win has to secure non-white working class, and he has to fight for the white suburban working class. If you have a platform that's antagonistic to a lot of middle class issues and values, then you run the risk that they will vote for the devil they know, Trump, over the devil they don't know, Sanders. And
there's some indications that, certainly historically, it's kind of weird that we're fighting the battle of, socialism versus populism, which is exactly what we beat the Soviet Union with. And of course, the Russians are here influencing our elections by dividing us into this sort of, are we now more of a socialist? Well, if you believe Sanders is in fact supported by some Russian influence, that there is it's sort of a reverse trajectory that we had the Soviet Union on in the 1980s.
Well, we have this, there's a rhetoric. Populism and socialism come out of the crisis of the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And they feed off of each other. They can link up together and they can fight each other. But, for example, Social Security is a socialist program. It's a public, federally mandated, nationally controlled annuity system. Mm-hmm. And so we have these entities in U.S. history where socialism has had its day. The problem is that socialism as a word is a bogeyman, but socialism as practiced in Western Europe still exists within democratic societies. So what Sanders and Warren are calling for is essentially a larger role of the public sector in regulating and managing this market economy that seems to be skewed towards the elites. But Trump is telling them that the problem is not the elites, the problem is China, Mexico's, and Muslims. He's telling you that it's not an economic question, it is a cultural question. And that's where I would be very leery of an election that is defined exclusively on sort of a battle between populism and socialism.
Well, especially coming off the back of what we've been through, which has, divided us so much and polarized the electorate to such an extent. You certainly want to try to get back to the middle, which is why, again, Bloomberg, Biden, the sort of middle of the road guys, seem to be the more likely candidates who'll be successful. One thought, please, from you on whether you think all this attention on Biden is actually going to hurt him in his candidacy.
Well, I think, if the Democrats want to look at the issue of real corruption that has occurred in the Trump White House and the behavior of his children, that's legal corruption in my mind. Mm-hmm. Even if what Hunter Biden did in the Ukraine is technically legal, the optics don't look good. No. So Biden knows that, when the Biden family stands at the Democratic convention, the balloons come down, Hunter Biden's on that stage, and the Republicans are going to point to him as he did the same thing. It happens everywhere. If Sanders does very well in Iowa and New Hampshire and Biden underperforms, we will move into South Carolina and into Super Tuesday. And my prediction is that Bloomberg will emerge as the anti-Sanders candidate in the party, and he has the money to pay for it.
Certainly does. He looks like he's gone up to 10%, 12% in some polls. It does look, for better or for worse, that Warren is not managing a comeback, and it doesn't look good for her campaign. So we are beginning to see these line up as certainly the race takes shape for 2020. It will be interesting, of course, if Donald Trump is there or not. I have one more number for you. Sure. 16 is the number of times the Senate has held impeachment trials in all. 8 were convictions. All of them were judges, but it does give you a 50% chance that according to precedent, if you will, that the Senate could convict the person who they're looking at in terms of a trial, which means there is a 50% chance, perhaps, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, could be impeached, convicted, and removed from office.
I would say yes. There's less of a partisan interpretation of a federal judge being removed.
Yeah.
Because when someone holds the awesome powers of the presidency, and when you're talking about essentially not with a federal judge rebuking an appointment and a confirmation from the Senate, you're talking about rebuking the last election, essentially.
Yeah, so, for sure, the judges thing makes it less of a valid statistic, but it's a point worth trying to make. But you're absolutely right. Certainly, politically, this has become much more contentious because judges are not normally viewed in that light. But it's an interesting stat, and who knows? It may happen. The next few days we have questions and answers from the senators. 2 days of that. And then what do we have after that? Like, say they vote right after that on whether they should hear witnesses. Is that correct?
Well, you're right. So basically, Wednesday and Thursday is going to be the senators submitting written questions to the Chief Justice. He will read them, and then the legal teams for each side will have a chance to answer those questions with the limit on how long the answer can be. I believe it's 4 minutes. On Friday, then the senators will have up to 4 hours to debate. And at some point on Friday, they will have to have a vote on whether or not there's going to be a witness like Bolton or witnesses, plural. And it can be sort of a open-ended plural vote, not likely, or a singular vote over Bolton. If the line gets crossed with Bolton with, say, 51 or 54 votes, I think there may be more, then the Republicans are going to try to flood that microphone with more witnesses. If we get more witnesses, a trial could go on for weeks. If for any reason McConnell holds his caucus down, and they'll say the Democrats don't get 51 votes, then without witnesses and with the 4 hours of debates, there could be a motion to call the vote on the articles.
So you're saying by this Friday we might even be able to get a vote on whether he's guilty or not guilty?
Yes. If McConnell has his way, they will vote down any witnesses. They will cap the debate to 4 hours, and then they will move for a vote on the articles. And unless 67 senators vote for either one of those articles, Trump remains in office.
So the Republic literally hangs in the balance over the next few days because some would see the president of office or staying in office as very consequential for the future of the Republic and the Constitution as we know it. Some people would argue that even the end of democracy. And that, there's a case for all of that. So this week is probably one of the most important in American history.
It's certainly, in living memory, this is certainly a constitutional crisis that, like I said, we have to go back to Watergate to see a constitutional crisis on this level. Trump would love for this to be done by Friday, Saturday at the latest, so that his $10 million ad to Super Bowl tees him up for his State of the Union address on Tuesday, in which you will see the president gloat that they came after me, they couldn't convict me, I'm still the president, and you will see the State of the Union literally be sort of a soapbox for his reelection.
It sure will be. And so the Super Bowl interview that he does on Sunday, I got to say, there's one person I wouldn't want to be right now, and that is any of the senators in those swing states, because they must be experiencing a lot of pressure to vote a certain way, even if they are feeling they should vote the right way. There's probably pressure coming from the White House and Mitch McConnell to do the right thing from their perspective.
I would agree.
What would you be asking, just if I can, the question you would ask in the next Q&A in the 48 hours? What's the one question you want to know?
That's a very good question.
It's putting you on the spot.
I would say, I would ask the Republican team, what exactly would the president have to do for you to warrant conviction and removal from office, if not this?
That's a good question. I like it. All right. Gary Darden, thank you very much for joining us again. It's been terrific having you on. Always a pleasure. This will be available on a podcast in the next day or two, as soon as I've edited it. In the meantime, you get the unedited version here on Periscope. Don't forget, you can always go to patreon.com/narrative and support Narrative for as little as $5 a month. It helps us pay the bills and makes us do all these shows and spend all of our time researching everything that we do here. And I want to thank you very much for joining us. We'll be live again next week with a very special show looking at the ties between Donald Trump and the mob, like really dissecting every single tie that he's had over the last few decades, actually, since the early 80s probably. And don't forget, you've got a few days where you can influence American history. Call your senators who are in those swing states. Tell them what you want, assuming you want a conviction and a removal from office. Demand that, or certainly demand witnesses. Everyone in the country deserves a fair trial, and so does America, even if they're being tried and trying at the same time the American president. So please go ahead, make sure you do those calls, and don't forget to join us next week on Narrative, and I'll see you on Twitter and on Periscope. Have a good night. Bye, Gary.
The powers of the presidency are immense, but they are not absolute.
How are you going to explain this?
Giuliani and the corrupt foreign prosecutor general had plans to, quote, do things to me.
A secure, democratic, and free Ukraine serves not just the Ukrainian people, but the American people.
He was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged.
The Ukrainian embassy staff asked what is going on with Ukrainian security assistance.
President Zelensky will do anything that you, meaning President Trump, ask him to.
Who would benefit from an investigation of the Bidens?
I assume President Trump.
And now, Ukraine is a battleground for great power competition, with a hot war for the control of territory and a hybrid war for